You never know who you'll run into while traveling. A few months ago, I was sitting in an airport in Japan, waiting for my flight back home, when I struck up a conversation with this guy. He looked worn out, like he hadn't slept in days, but we started talking. His name was Ben, an English teacher, who had spent some time living in our remote mountain village in Japan. At first, it seemed like small talk. You know, life in a small village, the beautiful forests, and the peaceful shrines he'd visit. But then, his tone changed. His eyes grew darker, and he leaned in closer, almost whispering like he didn't want anyone else to hear. Ben told me he had gone through something that shook him to his core. He didn't plan to tell anyone, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed to know. So, right there in the middle of the airport, as people rushed past us, he shared his story. A story about a shrine, a strange cult, and how it all nearly cost him his life. This is Ben's story, about the night he came face to face with a group of people who were far from ordinary, in a place he'll never forget. What you're about to hear is no legend. It happened, and Ben swears he still feels them watching. I moved to Japan last year, but I didn't go to one of the big cities like Tokyo or Osaka. No, I wanted something quieter, so I ended up in this tiny village deep in the mountains. It was so isolated that I barely had cell service. No Wi-Fi, no convenience stores, just mountains and trees. It sounded perfect at the time. I'd come to teach English at the village school, and I thought it'd be a chance to get away from the stress of my life back home. The village was small. There couldn't have been more than a few hundred people living there. Everyone was polite, but they mostly kept to themselves. My Japanese wasn't great, so I didn't talk to the locals much, but they smiled, nodded, and seemed friendly enough when I did. What really drew me in was the forest surrounding the village. I'd always been into hiking, and the trails here were like something out of a fairy tale. Thick trees, moss-covered rocks, and little shrines tucked away along the paths. These shrines were old, really old, and no one seemed to visit them. They were worn down, overgrown with moss and vines, but there was something peaceful about them. I started hiking almost every day, just to explore. One day, I found a trail that I hadn't seen before. It was narrower, barely noticeable, hidden between two thick trees. I followed it for about an hour until I stumbled upon a shrine that felt different from the others. It was smaller, more tucked away, almost like it didn't want to be found. The trees around it were huge, blocking out most of the sunlight, making the air cool and still. I didn't think much of it at first. I just sat down on a nearby rock, feeling the quiet of the place. But something about that shrine stuck with me. I kept going back to it, even when I didn't mean to. I'd head out on a hike, planning to explore a different trail, but I'd always end up at that shrine. Each time it felt stranger, like the air was heavier, and the forest was watching me. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't even know how to explain it. It was just odd. Then one evening, I was out hiking later than usual. The sun was setting, and I knew I should head back, but I wanted to visit the shrine one more time before dark. As I got closer, I heard something, whispering. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the leaves, but this was different. It was low, almost like people were murmuring right next to me, just out of earshot. I looked around, but there was no one there. I brushed it off and headed home. That night, I had the weirdest dream. I was standing in front of the shrine, but I wasn't alone. There were people there, all dressed in these long, dark robes, their faces hidden. They moved in complete silence, circling the shrine, like they were performing some kind of ritual. I wanted to speak, to ask what they were doing, but I couldn't. My throat felt tight, like something was holding me back. Then I woke up, drenched in sweat. I figured it was just a nightmare. I'd been spending too much time alone in the woods, letting my imagination get the best of me. But the dream wouldn't leave my head. It followed me through the day, making me feel uneasy. I didn't go back to the shrine for a while after that. A week later, though, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to head back to the shrine, just to prove to myself that it was all in my head. As I walked down the trail, everything felt wrong. The forest was too quiet, like the birds and insects had all disappeared. I finally reached the shrine, and that's when I saw them. People, just like in my dream. They were standing around the shrine, dressed in the same robes. At first, I thought it had to be a coincidence, maybe some local religious ceremony. But the way they moved, slow and synchronized, gave me chills, and not a single sound came from them. No chanting, no footsteps, nothing. It was like the air itself was holding its breath. I crouched down behind a tree, watching them, my heart pounding in my chest. They moved in circles around the shrine, their faces hidden beneath hoods. I don't know how long I watched them, but eventually they just disappeared. One minute they were there, the next they were gone. I didn't see them leave. They just vanished into the trees. I must have stood there frozen for a good 5 minutes before I could force myself to move. I ran all the way back to my house, my mind racing. What the hell had I just seen? I wanted to believe it was just some local tradition, but it felt off. Too creepy, too quiet. That night, I barely slept. The whispering was back, but this time, it was louder. It felt like it was coming from inside my own head, like the voices were trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. The next day, I tried asking around the village about the shrine. I didn't mention the people I saw, just casually asked if anyone knew about it. The reaction I got was unsettling. The villagers got tense, avoided eye contact, and changed the subject. One older man, a fisherman, finally looked at me with this serious expression and said, "You shouldn't go there. Stay away from that place." I pressed him for more information, but all he'd say was, "It's dangerous. Leave it alone." No one else would talk to me about it. Some of them even started avoiding me altogether. That should have been my sign to let it go, to stop poking around, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. Against my better judgment, I went back to the shrine one last time. I don't know why. It was like something was pulling me there, even though I was terrified of what I might find. As soon as I stepped onto the trail, I felt it. The heavy, oppressive air. The quiet that felt too thick to be natural. My heart was racing the whole way. When I reached the shrine, they were waiting for me. The same robed figures from before, but this time, they were standing still, facing me. It was like they'd been expecting me. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't turn back. I was frozen in place as they slowly closed in around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispering was back, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see their faces. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my house, lying in bed. My whole body ached like I'd been running for hours. But the worst part, the whispering was gone. The world was completely silent. It felt wrong, like a piece of me had been ripped away. I left the village the next day. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I just packed up and left. But I don't think I truly escaped. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I feel that same heavy air, that same watching presence. And I wonder if the cult is still out there, waiting for me to come back. Or maybe they never let me leave. It felt wrong, like a piece of me had been